Imagine a quiet afternoon, the kind where everything feels peaceful and normal. You're simply enjoying time with your grandchild, and then, with a single innocent drawing, your entire world shatters. This is a story about a woman named Margaret who found out a heartbreaking truth, not from a hushed whisper or a hidden letter, but from a child's pure, honest heart. The kettle was whistling softly, a comforting sound on a calm English afternoon. Clouds hung low in the sky, but there was no rain, just the gentle rustle of apple leaves outside. Margaret had just finished folding the laundry and was about to sit down with a good book. Her granddaughter, Lily, with crayon stains on her little fingers, gently tugged Margaret's sleeve. "Grandma, let's draw," she said. Margaret smiled. "All right, love. What shall we draw today?" Lily grinned, showing the small gap where her front tooth used to be. A tree and people under it. Margaret set the kettle aside, pouring the tea to drink later. She sat down at the kitchen table with Lily. The paper was already laid out, and crayons were scattered like a tiny, colorful burst. Lily began to draw with great focus. First, she drew a big, welcoming tree with curved branches reaching towards the sun. Then, two people beneath it, a man and a woman. She gave the man gray hair and glasses, and the woman a bright purple scarf and a long blue dress. Margaret sipped her tea and watched. "Who are they, darling?" she asked. Lily didn't look up. "It's Grandpa and Grandma." Margaret laughed softly. "Oh, is that me and Grandpa?" Lily shook her head right away. "No, Grandma, not you. The other Grandma. Grandma Susan." Margaret's hand froze halfway to her cup. She blinked slowly, hardly believing what she had just heard. "The other Grandma?" she repeated carefully. Lily nodded. "Yes, Grandpa said not to tell you." Then Lily looked up at Margaret, completely innocent and completely sure. They kissed under a tree, just like in the movies. Margaret gently put her cup down, so softly that she didn't even hear it touch the saucer. Her ears began to ring faintly, like they do right before a storm. "Susan," Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper. Lily hummed. She had the purple scarf. "I like that one. It looks soft." Lily went back to coloring, completely unaware that she had just turned Margaret's whole life upside down. Susan, her best friend for almost 30 years, the woman who held her hand when her daughter was born, at her mother's funeral, through every quiet moment of sadness life, threw at her. Margaret stared at the drawing again. The man had Richard's chin, her husband's chin. The woman wore Susan's glasses, and around her neck was the very purple scarf Susan had worn the last time she came over for dinner. Margaret had complimented it. Susan had laughed and said it was a gift from someone special. Oh, dear God! Margaret looked at Lily, who was now humming a school song, adding yellow flowers around the couple. Lily had no idea what her small hand had just uncovered. "Sweetheart," Margaret said carefully, "when did you see them like that?" "Last week," Lily said cheerfully. "After school. Grandpa picked me up. We went to the park. He said we were meeting a friend. It was Grandma Susan. They hugged and kissed and sat on a blanket." Margaret couldn't breathe, not out of anger yet, but from the heavy feeling of how easily the truth had slipped out from the mouth of a child. She slowly stood up and walked to the sink. She turned on the water, letting cold water run over her hands, trying to quiet the loud noise in her head. This wasn't a TV show. This wasn't a soap opera. This was her life, her husband, her best friend, her granddaughter, and a kiss under a tree. When Margaret returned to the table, Lily had finished her drawing. She beamed at it as if it were her greatest work. In a way, it was. She held it up to Margaret. "Do you like it, Grandma?" Margaret looked at it, truly looked at it. The two of them beneath the tree, a heart above their heads, the purple scarf. She swallowed the pain rising in her throat. "It's beautiful," she said. "You're very talented." Lily giggled and pulled out another sheet of paper. "I'm going to draw you and me next." And just like that, she was off again, completely unaware that her first drawing had broken something sacred. Margaret folded the paper gently and slid it under the old cookbook she kept on the counter. She wasn't ready to look at it again. Not yet. Later that night, once Lily was asleep and the house was quiet, Margaret sat by the window with a blanket over her lap and that drawing in her hand. There was no lipstick stain on a shirt collar, no secret text messages, no lipstick found in the car's glove box. Just this, a child's picture of the truth. No one had told Lily to lie. No one had taught her to deceive. And that's what made it so real. Margaret thought of every dinner Susan and she had shared at this very table, every time Susan poured wine, laughed too loudly at Richard's jokes, leaned a little too close when she thought Margaret wasn't looking. Had it started recently, or had it been going on for years? Margaret didn't know. All she knew was this: there were no more excuses to make, no more coincidences to explain away. The truth had come from the purest possible source, and it hurt more because of it. That night, Margaret didn't sleep. She watched the moon move across the sky, and she began to plan, not revenge, but the truth for herself. Because if they could bury it under a tree, she could uncover it with her silence. The mind does something strange when it is forced to see what it once chose to ignore. It plays back the past, but not in a kind way, not with happy memories. It makes every moment you ignored, every glance you missed, every feeling you pushed down in the name of trust, seem very clear. After Lily's drawing, Margaret couldn't stop remembering. And suddenly, everything she once thought was normal started looking like proof. The first memory that came rushing back was from last winter. Susan had canceled lunch. They were supposed to meet at the tea room in town, their usual monthly meeting, which was important and rarely missed. But that morning Susan had sent a text, caught something awful, coughing like crazy. "See you next week." Margaret had smiled at the phone, feeling sorry for her, even offered to drop off some soup. Susan politely said no, saying she didn't want Margaret to catch it. Later that afternoon, Margaret saw Susan in the garden center parking lot. Susan didn't see Margaret. She was getting out of Richard's car. She wore sunglasses, even though the sky was full of clouds, and she laughed as she handed Richard something, maybe her scarf. Margaret couldn't tell for sure. She remembered blinking, shocked. She almost honked her horn, but she didn't. Instead, she drove past. She told herself she was wrong. Maybe Richard had given her a ride. Maybe they had met by chance at the post office. Maybe. Margaret didn't even mention it to Richard that night, because to say it out loud would have meant asking a question, and she wasn't ready to hear the answer. Then there was the earring, a silver drop-shaped earring that Margaret found stuck between the seat and the door in Richard's car. She had been cleaning the car for him, something she always did in the spring. She remembered holding it up in the sunlight. It sparkled slightly, looking pretty and delicate, nothing like the big clip-on earrings she wore. "Is this mine?" she asked later that day, holding it up. Richard barely looked at it. "Probably Claire's," he said, taking it from her and throwing it into the junk drawer in the kitchen. But Claire hadn't been in that car for months. She lived 2 towns away and always took the train. The earring was gone by the next morning. Margaret had told herself she was thinking too much, that she had been watching too many detective shows. Then came the coat. Susan had a long, light brown coat made of expensive wool with big brown buttons. She had bought it after she got a promotion at her job, and she wore it like a shield. Margaret always admired it. One cold morning, Margaret went out to the storage shed to get the extension cord. Richard's car trunk was open. He had just come back from the market. Half hidden beneath the spare tire was a coat. Her coat. Margaret stood there, for a full minute just staring, and then she closed the trunk and went inside. She didn't ask because asking might start something she wasn't ready to finish. She'd rather live with doubt than have to act on certain proof. Or, at least, that's what she thought. Now, with Lily's drawing hidden in her drawer, those doubts became like falling dominoes, one after another. The scarf, the laughter, the perfume on his collar that wasn't hers, the late meetings that didn't quite make sense, the way he changed his phone password last summer, saying it was for work emails, even though Richard hadn't worked in 5 years. Margaret remembered the way Susan once touched his arm at a garden party. It wasn't wrong on the outside, but it lasted half a second too long. Margaret had noticed and done nothing, because what woman accuses her husband of having an affair with her best friend based on a touch? Now she realized every detail had been a piece of string, and she had let them stay separated until the truth was hidden right in front of her eyes. Margaret sat in the sunroom that night, watching the rain hit the glass, and let it all play back in her mind. All the moments she had dismissed, all the excuses she had believed, not because she was foolish, but because she was loyal, because she believed love meant thinking the best of someone, because she thought that after almost 40 years of marriage, she was safe, she was wrong, and that wrongness didn't come with loud alarms or shouts. It came with small betrayals, with silence, with a drawing from a child who had no reason to lie. Margaret walked to the bookshelf and pulled out their wedding album. Richard and she, 25 and smiling brightly. Susan just behind them, hands clasped, eyes shining. Margaret slowly turned the pages, stopping on one photo in particular, their anniversary trip to Cornwall. There they were on the beach, and just behind them, Susan taking the picture. Always there, always watching. And now Margaret couldn't unsee it. The way Susan had been woven into every part of their lives, not as a guest, but now Margaret feared, as a thief. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was how easy it had been for them, how natural, how practiced, like they had done it 100 times, sharing smiles behind her back, exchanging texts while Margaret set the table, kissing under trees while Margaret sat at home waiting for the kettle to boil. Margaret closed the album gently, as if it were something delicate. She wasn't angry yet, that would come later. But she was aware, fully and sharply. And there's something powerful about that change, when a woman moves from doubt to clear understanding. It's not loud. It's not about getting even. It's the quiet before a decision. And Margaret had just made hers. She would no longer ignore the path that memory had laid before her. She would follow it, not to confront them yet, but to get back the woman they thought would never see, the one who saw everything just a little too late. Margaret had always believed that some people enter your life like seasons. They come, they pass, they leave behind color or cold, and then they go. But Susan was different. She wasn't a season. She was the very ground beneath the life Margaret built. Margaret met her when her daughter Claire was still a baby. Margaret was young, tired, and in the strange fog of new motherhood. One morning at the community center, Susan walked over with a tin of cookies and a smile that felt real. She sat beside Margaret as if she already knew her name, and within minutes they were laughing like old friends. From that day forward, Susan became a regular part of Margaret's life. She was there when Claire took her first steps, with her camera ready, cheering louder than even Richard. She brought flowers to Margaret's father's funeral, cooked lasagna when Margaret had the flu, and gave her hand cream when Margaret cried hard in the pharmacy parking lot the year her mom died. That night, Margaret sat on the kitchen floor in her nightgown, unable to lift a teacup without crying. Susan let herself in. She wrapped Margaret in a blanket, made toast, and sat beside her for hours without speaking. "You're allowed to break," she whispered finally. "I'm here to hold the pieces." And she did. When Margaret's marriage to Richard had its quiet, dull times with no big fights, just a slow fading of the sparkle, it was Susan who reminded Margaret that being together was a different kind of love, that being understood was sometimes more important than being desired. "You two are strong," Susan told her once. "You're the kind of couple that makes people believe in marriage." Margaret held on to those words. Now she knew sometimes people say nice things about the life they want to steal. After Lily's drawing, Margaret tried to act normally. She tried to pretend the truth hadn't just been drawn in crayons by a child too young to lie. But something inside her broke. She stopped sleeping. Her dreams, once gentle, turned into quicksand. Memories of shared dinners, matching coats, glasses clinking. She couldn't look at her own wedding photos without searching the corners to see if Susan was there. She always was. Margaret didn't eat much. Toast would go cold. Tea tasted like metal. Her body moved through daily tasks, brushing her hair, folding laundry, checking the mailbox. But her mind was somewhere else, walking through dark rooms built of doubt and memory. The worst part wasn't what she saw now. It was what she had missed. All the signs had been there. She just hadn't wanted to believe they were for her. So Margaret found herself sitting at the kitchen table late one evening, looking through old letters Susan had sent her. Birthday cards, thank you notes, even the one from when Claire got into university. Susan always signed off the same way. "Forever your Susan, always beside you." Margaret used to read that and feel warmth. Now she read it and felt like a fool, because Susan had been beside her at every dinner, every family holiday, every picnic with Richard, right beside her, smiling, and slowly, while Margaret wasn't looking, she'd stepped in front. Susan didn't steal him with intense feelings or trying to attract him. No, that would have been easier to accept. She stole him with patience, with being familiar with the long, slow trick of closeness. She didn't climb into Margaret's marriage. She quietly, politely walked through the front door Margaret had left open, carrying wine and laughter and a shared past. And Richard, he let her, because nothing about their betrayal was sudden. It was slow, silent, like rot beneath floorboards. You don't see it until you fall through. Margaret tried to write in a journal one night, something she hadn't done in years. She wrote one sentence and couldn't finish it. "I don't know who I miss more, my husband or my friend," because the truth was she missed both, but neither of them were real anymore, not as she had known them. The people she missed existed only in memory. Margaret once told Susan everything, her fears about getting older, her anger when Richard retired, and only talked about golf, her guilt about feeling lonely in a full house. Susan had listened, and she had taken that information piece by piece and used it to build a bridge, not to help Margaret cross, but to walk away with the man Margaret loved. Margaret didn't know what hurt her more, Richard's betrayal or Susan's knowledge of the exact way to do it. Because Susan knew exactly where Margaret kept the extra key, exactly when Margaret went out for groceries, exactly how Margaret folded their napkins. The betrayal didn't feel like a sudden stab. It felt like a careful taking apart. And Margaret was the last to know the house was falling apart. One night, Margaret stood in the shower for too long. The water turned cold, but she didn't move. She just stood there, arms crossed, forehead pressed to the wall, repeating one thought: "She held my baby before Richard ever did." The deep closeness of that thought felt too much to bear. Susan hadn't just touched Margaret's life. She'd been woven into it. And now Margaret had to pull her out of every memory like a thread from a favorite sweater. It left holes, but Margaret would rather live with holes than with something that looked complete but wasn't. Margaret started closing the window blinds at night, not because she feared them, but because she was finally learning how to protect herself. And she stopped answering Susan's texts. Susan messaged her twice that week, once with a funny picture, once with thinking of you. Want to meet for tea? Margaret stared at the phone screen for a full 5 minutes. Then she deleted the messages, because healing, she had learned, isn't always about fixing something. Sometimes it's about refusing to be put back into a pattern you didn't agree to. Susan had once promised Margaret forever, but the truth was Susan was never someone Margaret should have trusted. Margaret waited a week before calling Susan. Not because she needed more time to think, not because she was unsure, but because she wanted to see if Susan would reach out first. She didn't. No call, no text, no casual invitation to drop by for tea like she used to. Susan's silence was louder than any confession. It was a Tuesday when Margaret finally picked up the phone. She waited until the house was empty. Claire had taken Lily to visit friends, and Margaret was alone with the sound of her own thoughts. She boiled water, poured a cup of calming chamomile tea, and sat down at the kitchen table. The phone in her hand felt heavier than it should. She took a breath, then she dialed. Susan answered on the second ring. Margaret, her voice was a little too cheerful. What a surprise. I was just thinking about you. Were you? Margaret said evenly. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. No, Susan replied quickly. Just folding laundry, never ending. Margaret smiled, though Susan couldn't see it. Claire sent me something this week. Margaret said. A drawing Lily did. There was a slight pause, the kind only noticeable when you're listening for it. Oh, Susan said, light and easy. She's quite the little artist, that one. She is, Margaret agreed. Very detailed. She drew a tree and 2 people sitting under it. Another pause, this one longer. How sweet, Susan managed. Yes, Margaret continued, letting her voice become soft like velvet. A man and a woman sitting beneath a tree, kissing. Actually, there was no reply. She said it was Grandpa, Margaret said, and Grandma Susan. Margaret could hear Susan swallow through the silence, a faint catch in her breath. Still, she said nothing. She even remembered your purple scarf, Margaret added, said it looked soft. Margaret could almost hear Susan moving, perhaps sitting down, trying to calm herself. Margaret gave her a moment. Then she added gently, almost like a joke, almost like she might still let Susan laugh it off. Funny though, she said Richard told her to keep it a secret. There it was. Silence. But not the kind of silence that comes from confusion, not the kind that means, I don't understand. This silence was full of knowledge. It was heavy with guilt, with recognition, with the understanding that a child had undone what they had carefully hidden. When someone is wrongly accused, they defend themselves right away. When someone is guilty, they pause. Margaret let the silence stretch. She wanted Susan to feel it, not in anger, but in truth. When Susan finally spoke, her voice had dropped a little. Children, she said, they misunderstand things. Margaret almost admired the effort, the attempt. Do they? Margaret replied softly. Yes, they mix things up, Susan said, trying to sound calm. You know how their imaginations are always making things up. She was quite specific, Margaret said. The scarf, the kiss, the heart above your heads. Another pause. Susan wasn't good at this. Margaret imagined her sitting in her living room, phone pressed to her ear, staring at nothing, maybe the same couch Richard had once sat on, maybe still warm from his visits. I don't know what she saw, Susan said finally, but if she said that, I'm sorry, I would never. Margaret stopped her gently. No need to explain, she said. It wasn't a confrontation, Susan. Just sharing what Claire passed along. Margaret waited. Susan said nothing more. No denial. No anger. No laughter at how silly it all was. Just silence. A silence full of things Susan would never admit. And that was all Margaret needed. She stood up and walked to the sink, holding the phone to her ear. Then she said the last words she would ever speak to Susan. "I think this is the part where you stop pretending." And before Susan could reply, Margaret gently ended the call. No loud click, no drama, just a quiet goodbye wrapped in truth. She placed the phone on the counter, took a sip of her now cool tea, and looked out at the garden. It was the same view as always, but somehow Margaret saw everything differently. Susan's silence had said more than any words ever could. It had confessed everything without any big show, and Margaret didn't need to hear, "I'm sorry," because the woman she had been, the one who needed explanations, who wanted things to be fixed, she didn't live here anymore. The woman standing in her place had found something far more valuable, her voice. It was a gray morning, the kind that feels heavy on your chest even before you open the curtains. Margaret hadn't planned it, but there are moments when your feet move before your mind can decide, and suddenly you're halfway down the road, holding a folded piece of paper in your coat pocket like a secret too tired to stay hidden. Susan lived just 4 streets away. Margaret had walked that path hundreds of times before, carrying warm cookies with birthday cards, with stories she couldn't wait to tell her. But never like this. This time, Margaret walked like a witness carrying proof, not because she needed to accuse, but because she needed to return what never belonged to Susan. When she reached Susan's front door, Margaret didn't hesitate. She knocked twice, firmly, as if she had every right to be there. Because she did. The door opened slowly, as if it knew what was coming. Susan stood there in her house slippers and a dark blue sweater Margaret recognized from a shopping trip they took years ago. Her face froze the moment she saw Margaret. Not surprised, no, not surprised, just caught. "Margaret," Susan said, her voice barely a sound. I wasn't expecting—" "No," Margaret said calmly. "You wouldn't be." Susan stepped aside without being asked. Her eyes quickly looked behind her, and that's when Margaret saw him. Richard. He was standing in her living room, not 3 steps from the doorway. His sweater was messy, as though he had only just gotten up from her sofa. His face turned pale. The second their eyes met. No words passed between them. They didn't need to. Margaret walked in, with no polite words, no greetings, just the quiet sound of her shoes on Susan's shiny floor. She stopped in the center of the room, the same room she'd helped Susan paint that silly light yellow years ago, the same room where Margaret had once laughed over red wine, holding Susan's hand after Susan's divorce. And now it held something else, something rotten. Margaret reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the folded drawing. She placed it on the table between them, slowly unfolding it as if it were something sacred. Lily's crayon masterpiece, the tree, the scarf, the kiss. Susan stared at it, her lips slightly parted. Richard looked away. "She drew it last week," Margaret said, her voice calm. "She said you kissed under the tree. Said Richard told her to keep it a secret." Neither of them spoke. Margaret turned to Richard. "Did you—" He didn't look up. His shoulders dropped. And for the first time in their marriage, Margaret saw him for what he was, not strong, not silent, just small. Margaret turned back to Susan. "We've known each other 30 years, she said. "You were there when Claire was born. You held me when my mother died. You sat at my kitchen table and called me your sister." Susan's eyes were filling with tears, but Margaret didn't care. "You didn't just betray me," Margaret said. "You watched me trust you every single day, and you still went behind my back." Still, they said nothing. Because what do you say when you've been caught, not by a detective, but by a child with a box of crayons? Margaret stepped closer, not out of anger, but because she needed to look Susan in the eyes when she said it. 30 years of friendship, Margaret whispered, and you both broke it with one kiss. Susan's lips trembled. Richard shifted as if to speak. Margaret held up a hand. "Don't." She didn't want apologies. Apologies are for accidents. This was never an accident. It was built, chosen, protected. Margaret walked to the door, slowly, without drama, her hand on the doorknob. She turned once more. I won't scream. I won't tell gossip. I won't ruin your lives. And then, almost kindly, she added, but I will never forget what you took from me. With that, she opened the door. Behind her, they stood in their silence, like children in a room that had just lost its air. Margaret walked out, closed the door gently, and stepped into the cold. There was no need to look back, because whatever remained in that house behind her wasn't worth seeing again. Let them sit with their shame. Let them carry the weight. Margaret had carried enough for all three of them. The day Margaret moved out, she didn't cry. There was no big scene, no shouting match, no broken glass on the kitchen floor. She simply woke up, packed 3 suitcases, and left the house Richard, and she had lived in for 37 years. It was the same house where she baked birthday cakes, ironed his shirts, hosted holidays, and took care of him when he was sick. The same house where she once believed nothing could ever hurt them. The same walls that had heard every laugh and secret between Susan and her. Now those walls held only echoes of things Margaret no longer trusted. Margaret didn't leave because she was broken. She left because she was strong enough to know she deserved better. The small house or cottage had been empty since her mother passed away. It wasn't fancy, small with low ceilings and windows that rattled in the wind, but it was hers. No one had ever lied to her within those walls. No one had kissed someone else behind closed doors. It held only the quiet smell of lavender and books, and memories of a woman who taught Margaret how to stand on her own. Margaret hired a local moving company. Claire offered to help, but Margaret asked her not to. She needed to do this herself. She wasn't leaving in shame. She was walking out with her back straight and her silence unbroken. When the sale of the house went through, the lawyer gently asked, "Would you like to list Richard as a co-seller?" Margaret shook her head. "It's in my name. Always has been." He blinked, then nodded, filing the papers. Just like that, the chapter closed. No arguments over belongings, no pleading. Richard didn't call. Margaret imagined Susan was still there, watching the mail, wondering if Margaret would come after them. She didn't. Margaret had no interest in getting even. She was far too busy building something new. The cottage needed work, but nothing Margaret couldn't handle. She painted the living room a soft, light green. She scrubbed the kitchen tiles with lemon oil until they shined. She hung up photographs of Claire and Lily, new ones, not touched by the past. Every Friday, she picked Lily up from school. Every Saturday, they painted. It started with a small notebook. Margaret gave Lily a set of watercolor pencils and told her she could draw whatever she liked. Lily chose stars and cats and stick figures wearing ballet skirts. Margaret tried to copy her style at first, clumsy and loose, but soon she began drawing landscapes, rolling hills, apple trees, winding roads that led to nowhere in particular. It wasn't just art, it was freedom. Lily would sit beside her, head bent in concentration, and ask questions like, "Why do birds fly away in winter?" Or, "Do you think trees talk to each other?" And Margaret would answer, sometimes with truth, sometimes with magic. Margaret watched Lily's world unfold through colors, and her own world unfold beside hers. She had never realized how healing it could be to start over with no one watching, to wake up and not wonder if someone was lying next to you, to eat toast at midnight, to hang wind chimes without asking anyone's opinion. For the first time in years, Margaret heard her own thoughts, and they were kind. Claire came to visit often. At first, there was a hesitation in her eyes, as if she didn't quite know how to treat this new version of Margaret. But over time, that faded. One Sunday morning, Claire looked around the cottage and said, "You look lighter here." Margaret smiled. That's because I am. She didn't miss Richard, not the man he had become. She missed the idea of him, the man who used to bring her daffodils in spring, the one who rubbed her back during Claire's long labor. But Margaret had learned that sometimes the person we miss never really existed. They were just the version we made up to get through the years beside them. Susan? Margaret didn't miss her at all. She had spent so long believing that friendship meant forgiveness, that loyalty meant swallowing pain. But loyalty, Margaret learned, isn't about how long you stand beside someone. It's about whether they deserve your company to begin with. And neither of them did. One morning, Margaret stood by the kitchen window, watching the wind play with the curtains, and realized she wasn't waiting anymore. Not for things to be fixed, not for apologies, not for someone to understand. She didn't need understanding. She needed peace. And she had found it. It wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with a marching band or a big discovery. It came with freshly baked cookies, with Lily's laughter echoing in the garden, with the feel of a paintbrush in her hand. It came with quietness, with choosing herself. Margaret planted roses along the back fence that spring. Her mom had always loved roses. She used to say, "They look delicate, but you should see how deep their roots go." Margaret thought she finally understood what her mom meant. She wasn't fragile. She was planted, rooted in a truth no one could take from her, not with kisses or lies or betrayal wrapped in a friend's smile. Margaret wasn't putting back together the life she had lost. She was creating one that had never been allowed to fully grow before. And this time, she wouldn't say sorry for how brightly it grew. It had been a year since Margaret walked out of the house on Wren Hill. A full cycle of seasons had come and gone. The rose bushes she planted behind the cottage had bloomed once, died back, and begun to grow again. Margaret baked bread on Sundays. She painted every Friday with Lily. She went to bed without checking her phone. She slept soundly for the first time in decades. Peace, she had learned, doesn't arrive loudly. It moves in gently, like the tide coming to claim what's always been its own. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March, the phone rang. Margaret was in the kitchen, kneading dough, sleeves rolled up, hands covered in flour. Claire was due in an hour with Lily, and Margaret was making cinnamon rolls for their visit. The old landline buzzed. An unknown number, but local. Margaret wiped her hands on a dish towel and answered. "Hello." A pause. Then a voice she hadn't heard in nearly 12 months. "Margaret." It was Richard. His voice was thinner now, weak. It sounded like it had been filtered. "I'm in the hospital," he said after a pause. "They said it was a small stroke. Nothing lasting. I'll get better, but I can't do much on my own right now." Margaret didn't speak. "I called Susan first," he said, with a bitter, humorless laugh. "But she's gone. Packed up. Said she needed to find herself. Left without a word." Margaret closed her eyes. "Of course she did. She left me," he said again. "I haven't heard from her in weeks." Another silence. And then, "I need someone, Margaret." Margaret kept quiet. He took an unsteady breath. "I need you there." It was not an apology, not really just a request that pretended to be regret. He continued, his voice a whisper now. "You were always there, always steady, always kind. Didn't I? I didn't know how much that meant until it wasn't there anymore." Margaret walked to the sink and looked out at the garden. The apple tree was just beginning to bloom. Lily had drawn it last week, Margaret and Lily beneath it again, holding ice cream cones, a heart-shaped kite above their heads. Lily hadn't drawn Richard once in months. Margaret remembered what Lily told her after her last sleepover. "You smile more now, Grandma." And Margaret did, because she no longer lived with the burden of being needed without being valued. Margaret brought the phone back to her ear, calm and clear. "You had me," she said gently. "For 37 years, you had my patience, my loyalty, my silence." He didn't interrupt. "And you traded me," Margaret continued, "for a lie, for convenience, for comfort. You thought I'd be here forever, no matter what." Another pause. Margaret could hear the hospital sounds in the background, the distant beeping of machines, the hushed voices of nurses. The world around him had shrunk to a bed, a call button, and a phone.